Eddie Van Halen changed how people play guitar. He inspired millions of musicians and changed rock music forever. But even though he smiled a lot and played amazing solos, he had problems with other guitarists that most people didn't know about. There were 6 guitar players he looked up to, competed against, and sometimes really disliked. What caused these fights between famous musicians? And why did some of rock's biggest names end up on Eddie's list of people he couldn't stand? Let's find out about the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen hated the most. Before Eddie became famous, before the huge crowds, teenage Eddie Van Halen was in his bedroom in Pasadena with a cheap guitar and old Cream albums. Every night he played Crossroads over and over, trying to copy every note that Eric Clapton played on his Les Paul guitar. Clapton wasn't just someone Eddie liked. He was the whole reason Eddie started playing guitar. Eddie once told Guitar World magazine, "Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." Back then, Eddie didn't care about being famous or having the perfect sound or writing songs. He just wanted to understand what made Clapton's playing feel so special. The way Clapton played, held notes, and left spaces between them, all of that became part of who Eddie was as a musician. But things change over time. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had done something even Clapton never did. He completely reinvented how to play electric guitar. When his song Eruption came out, it sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard before. His two-handed tapping style, squealing harmonics, and crazy dive bombs changed what people thought was possible on guitar. All of a sudden, this quiet kid from Pasadena became the future of rock music. Fans loved him, but not everyone was happy about it. The older musicians, the ones Eddie used to worship, listened to his music with doubt. In 1980, someone asked Clapton what he thought about Van Halen. His answer shocked Eddie. Clapton said, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." It seemed like just a casual comment, but it really hurt. For Eddie, it broke his heart. The man who taught him how to play was now saying his music had no feeling, that it was too mechanical. Years later, Eddie said, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie never said anything mean about Clapton in interviews. He never insulted him back, but his friends say he quietly struggled with the disappointment. It felt so weird to be rejected by his hero. Part of the problem came from how they thought about music differently. Clapton's guitar style was about holding back and playing blues music where the tone and phrasing told the story. Eddie's style was about freedom, distortion, feedback, and trying new things without being scared. In a way, they represented 2 different time periods. Clapton was the sound of the 60s. Eddie was the sound of the future. But even though it hurt, Eddie never stopped admiring Clapton. In 1995, Eddie said, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The 2 men finally met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie was excited and hopeful, like a fan meeting his hero for the first time. But Clapton was polite and cold. They talked about guitars, sound, and amplifiers, but they didn't talk about emotions or feelings. After the meeting, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I loved the myth more than the person." That moment changed Eddie. That's when he stopped thinking of famous musicians as gods and started seeing them as regular people, talented but not perfect. Later, when someone asked if Clapton's words still bothered him, Eddie laughed quietly and said, "Nah, maybe he didn't get it. Maybe I didn't get him either. We're from different planets, man." That line described them perfectly. 2 guitar legends from completely different worlds. Clapton painted pictures with blues and darkness. Eddie threw bright neon colors across the sky. After Eddie died in 2020, people say Clapton spoke kindly about him in private, calling him a true innovator. Even though he never said anything publicly, fans who knew their story understood what that meant. By then, Eddie had already made peace with everything. In 2001, he told Guitar World, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I." Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that. In the end, Eddie still admired Clapton. That never went away, it just grew up. "I'll always be chasing what I heard on those old Cream records," he once said. That's where the fire started. Eddie's heartbreak over Clapton was deep, but his next fight was even more intense. This time it wasn't about disappointment, it was pure competition. Two guitar gods, one stage, and no space for both. What happens when Eddie Van Halen faces off against the dark wizard of the Stratocaster guitar? There are few things scarier for a young guitar player than meeting someone you look up to, especially when that person is Ritchie Blackmore, the moody and unpredictable genius from Deep Purple and Rainbow. For teenage Eddie Van Halen, Blackmore wasn't just another rock star, he was like a master of guitar tone. Eddie studied songs like Burn and Highway Star note by note, playing them over and over until his fingers bled. He loved how precise Blackmore's solos were, how his distortion sounded sharp, and that spooky dramatic feeling in every riff. To Eddie, Ritchie was one of the few who could make a guitar sound truly alive. When Van Halen's first album exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself standing next to the men he'd grown up worshipping. He wasn't just a kid with a cheap Strat guitar copy in his bedroom anymore. He was now an equal, a chart-topping guitarist who was rewriting the rules of rock music. But the dream turned sour quickly when he finally met one of his heroes. In a 1982 interview with Guitar Player magazine's Jas Obrecht, Eddie talked about their first meeting. "He just stared at me," Eddie said. "Wouldn't say hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life and he just blew me off." That silence hurt worse than any insult could have. Eddie wasn't cocky or full of himself. He was surprisingly friendly and open, a guy who could talk about guitar equipment and pickup wiring for hours. He'd jam with anyone and laughed easily. What stuck with him about Ritchie was the coldness, the blank stare, the lack of warmth, the total absence of any connection. Years later, Eddie brought it up again. "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," perfectly described how it felt. Eddie had just released Eruption, a guitar solo that blew everyone's minds and made every rock musician rethink what was possible on guitar. But his heroes, the men whose posters used to hang on his bedroom wall, looked at him with something colder than competition. They looked at him with dismissal. Part of it was just Ritchie's personality. Blackmore was famously difficult, even with people in his own band. His mysterious image depended on keeping his distance, and when someone asked him years later what he thought of Van Halen, his response felt like both a compliment and an insult. "He's a fine player," Blackmore said, "but I think he plays too many notes." Fans argued for years about what that meant. Was it jealousy or old-fashioned snobbery? Really, it showed a deeper split between two different eras of rock guitar. Blackmore's style came from classical music phrasing and holding back. Every bend and vibrato was on purpose and controlled. Eddie's playing was the opposite, flowing, explosive, and unlimited. Where Ritchie created control, Eddie represented freedom. It wasn't exactly a fight, more like a standoff between generations. Eddie was the face of a new movement, the California innovators who rewired their amplifiers, built their own guitars, and chased sounds no one had ever heard. Blackmore was the last of the strict British hard rock purists, his guitar work based on precision and structure. Still, Eddie never let that cold encounter turn into bitterness. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he looked back with understanding. "I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshipped that guy growing up. Still do." And over time, even Ritchie softened his view. In 2008, he told Classic Rock magazine, "Eddie Van Halen brought something new. I can't deny that. What he did with the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He found his own voice. It was recognition, the very thing Eddie had once hoped for." Their paths went in different directions, but they stayed connected by influence. Blackmore drifted into medieval ballads and Renaissance melodies with his band Blackmore's Night, chasing elegance over aggression. Eddie stayed restless, forever tinkering with his guitars and tone circuits, chasing the sound no one else could find. And he did find it. By the time the world lost Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even hardcore Blackmore fans had accepted what their hero finally admitted. He was brilliant. He found something that everyone else was trying to find. The words came decades too late, but for Eddie Van Halen, they were enough. But Eddie would soon face a different kind of rejection, one that was loud, full of swagger, and dripping with attitude. In 1978, Van Halen was the new thunderstorm rolling across rock music's sky, raw, electrifying, and impossible to ignore. The band's first album had just started shaking up radio, and Eddie Van Halen, barely 23 years old, was still the hungry kid from Pasadena, trying to prove he belonged among the guitar legends. Every night on tour, he tore through solos like his life depended on it. But behind the amplifiers and flashing lights, something quietly stung him. The cold indifference from the men he'd grown up idolizing, players like Joe Perry from Aerosmith. Eddie once told Jas Obrecht in a 1982 guitar player interview how that early tour felt. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes," he remembered. "Wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way." Imagine being the young genius on the road, playing with everything you've got, night after night. And when you finally run into the heroes whose posters hung on your wall, they don't even look your way. No nod, no smile, just that cold, unreadable stare. He felt that Perry and others like Ritchie Blackmore saw him as a threat. In that same interview, he said it directly. They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened. It wasn't just bitterness, it was an honest understanding of what was happening in the late 70s. Eddie's style, flowing, fearless, and based on invention, had redrawn the map of how to play electric guitar. The old guard was about blues and swagger. The new generation was about speed, precision, and experimenting with sound. Perry, a cornerstone of 70s hard rock, came from a school built on heavy riffs and raw attitude. His tone was thick, swampy, and full of sleaze, the soundtrack of cigarette smoke and backstage chaos. Eddie's tone, by contrast, was like lightning in stereo. His two-hand tapping, his use of harmonics and whammy bar dives, and his obsession with shaping his tone made his sound futuristic, almost alien. To some veterans, it didn't feel like evolution, more like an invasion. Eddie never confronted Perry publicly, never lashed out. But privately, he couldn't shake how strange it felt to be treated like an outsider by the very people who'd inspired him. He wasn't asking for mentorship, just a handshake, a moment of shared respect. Instead, he walked away with a quiet determination. If they wouldn't open the door, he'd build a new one. Still, Eddie's heart wasn't wired for holding grudges. He loved the guitar too much for that. He once said, "I don't give a fuck if I'm playing a Holiday Inn lounge, I enjoy playing." That line said everything about his spirit. He played for the pure thrill of creating, not for politics or approval. Music to him was an act of joy, and if others couldn't see that, it was their loss. Ironically, years later, Joe Perry completely changed his mind. Time has a way of stripping away ego and leaving only truth. In 2013, during an interview covered by Van Halen News Desk, Perry looked back with open admiration. "Eddie's playing was just phenomenal. He took everything that he'd heard and put his own stamp on it. I thought, oh my God, this is great." He reinvented guitar playing. Perry described hearing Van Halen's first album for the first time, completely blown away by what he was listening to. "I was blown away," he admitted. "I kept going back to figure out those little tricks and things, the sound, the energy. It was just so different." For Eddie, that late respect came too late to erase the sting of those early years, but it spoke volumes about his impact. Even those who once turned away eventually had to acknowledge what he had done, not just for rock music, but for the guitar itself. And yet, even at his peak, he never talked down to anyone. The same humility that marked his early disappointment stayed with him. When asked about players from the previous generation, Eddie always spoke with warmth. "They made me want to play. he said. "I wouldn't be here without them." By the time Eddie earned Joe Perry's respect, he'd already stopped chasing anyone's approval. But the next clash wasn't personal. It was intellectual. What happens when Eddie Van Halen collides with the MIT-trained genius who built Boston's perfection from a basement lab? It was supposed to be just another sunny afternoon show in the late 1970s. Van Halen and Boston sharing a concert bill, both riding the wave of America's new rock scene. The crowd was buzzing, beers in hand, the stage humming with feedback. Eddie Van Halen had just finished his guitar solo. Raw, fearless, dripping with adrenaline. The audience was still roaring when Tom Schultz stepped up next. Then something weird happened. Tom Schultz from Boston, too, Eddie later remembered. "We played right before them, I forget where, and I do my solo. And then all of a sudden he does my solo. It was real weird because it was a daytime thing. I was standing on stage, and the whole crowd was looking at me like, 'What's this guy doing?' I was drunk. I got pissed." The image stuck with him. Some fans thought Schultz was paying tribute. Others thought he was copying. To Eddie, it felt like theft. Not of riffs, but of identity. That irritation grew sharper because Schultz wasn't exactly warm backstage. Eddie described him bluntly. "He never comes around, he doesn't say hi, doesn't do anything. Just kind of hides out, runs on stage and plays and disappears afterwards." The mix of imitation and aloofness stung. Eddie respected confidence, but silence felt like arrogance to him. Tom Schultz, on the other hand, wasn't trying to steal thunder. He was the opposite of Eddie in almost every way. A perfectionist engineer with a master's degree from MIT in mechanical engineering who recorded Boston's first album in his basement studio. He built his own equipment, fine-tuned every frequency, and created the Rockman amp system that shaped arena rock's glossy tone. Where Eddie played by instinct, Schultz worked by science. Their worlds collided like oil and water. Eddie was chaos and feel. Schultz was structure and control. One lived for improvisation. The other trusted formulas. And yet both chased the same goal: the perfect sound. Eddie hinted at this frustration in a 1980 interview with Guitar Player magazine. "There were guys out there already trying to play what I was doing, the tapping, the runs, all that stuff. Even people who'd been around longer. It's flattering, but it's like, hey man, come up with your own thing." He didn't name Schultz directly, but everyone knew who he meant. Roadies whispered about it for months. To Eddie, originality wasn't optional. It was sacred. He'd built his Frankenstrat guitar by hand, soldering pickups, sawing bodies, and blowing up amps until he found his voice. Seeing someone mirror that sound felt like watching a stranger wear your face. "There's a difference between inspiration and duplication," he told Guitar World years later. "You can be inspired by someone's playing, that's how we all start. But if you don't evolve, you're just tracing someone else's shadow." Schultz never publicly addressed the story. He was famously private, preferring soldering irons to microphones. Yet his reserved personality clashed naturally with Eddie's open, beer-in-hand charisma. Crew members said Schultz would spend hours backstage adjusting sound levels, while Eddie laughed with fans and swapped guitar tips. Two geniuses, same passion, different planets. Critics loved comparing them. What separated them philosophically was emotion. "If you think too much," Eddie once said, "you lose it. Music isn't about formulas, it's about feel." That line summed up why Schultz's precision sometimes rubbed him the wrong way. Because to Eddie, imperfection was the magic. Still, mutual respect eventually surfaced. In a rare Boston Globe interview from the early 80s, Schultz admitted, "He's got imagination. You can't teach that." And Eddie, decades later, returned the courtesy. "The guy built half the stuff he used. That's cool. I respect anyone who gets their hands dirty." Years later, when asked whether it bothered him that others had copied his style, Eddie smiled. "If they do, good for them. But they'll never sound like me. Nobody can sound like anybody else, not really." But while Eddie was learning to live with imitation, another storm was waiting, colder, sharper, and far more personal. It's 1978. Van Halen is exploding. The first album is out, the crowds are wild, and Eddie Van Halen's guitar is rewriting the rules of rock. Every night feels electric, like the sound of the future being born. Then comes the night Rick Derringer opens for them. Derringer's a veteran, a respected player with real history, someone Eddie grew up admiring. But what happens next shakes Eddie to his core. After the show, Eddie walks into the bar, still wired from the adrenaline. He finds Derringer and says, "Hey Rick, I grew up on your ass. How can you do this? I don't care if you use the technique. Don't play my melody." Eddie's words carry three emotions at once: admiration, betrayal, and a demand for respect. He isn't angry that Derringer used tapping. He's angry that he copied his solo, note for note, melody for melody, in front of the same audience. Inspiration is one thing. Copying exactly is another. The next night, Derringer does it again. Same notes, same phrasing, even closing his set with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had already turned into a live anthem. Eddie's patience snaps. He tells Derringer straight, "If you're going to keep doing that, you ain't opening for us." And just like that, Derringer is off the tour. For Eddie, this wasn't about ego. It was about identity. Van Halen was still carving its place in history, and Eddie's sound, the tapping, the tone, the volcanic energy, was the heart of it. Seeing it mimicked so bluntly, especially by someone he respected, felt like theft. Years later, he admitted, "It's fucked, you know, because I'd copied some of his chops way back then." The sting came not from imitation itself, but from watching a hero cross that line. To understand why it hit so hard, you have to know how Eddie saw music. His father, Jan Van Halen, a jazz musician, taught him early, "If you play someone else's song, make it your own." Eddie lived by that rule. Every time he picked up a guitar, he was chasing something no one had heard before. When someone copied his solo exactly, it wasn't just about notes. It was about stealing the soul behind them. By 1979, every guitarist in America was trying to sound like him. Eruption had blown the doors off everything. Magazines obsessed over his secret technique. Players slowed down their turntables just to study his fingers. But Derringer wasn't a kid in a garage. He was a peer, a professional. And that made it different. Behind the scenes, the band couldn't stop talking about it. David Lee Roth, ever the showman, joked, "We don't do cover bands, especially not of us." But for Eddie, it wasn't funny. It was a warning. The more famous he got, the more people would try to take pieces of what he'd built. And yet, even in anger, Eddie handled it with rare composure. No public insults, no backstage fights. Just a quiet, firm boundary. He drew a line in the sand, not out of arrogance, but out of pride. He'd worked too hard for his sound to let someone else wear it. Over the years, that fury softened into perspective. By the 1990s, Eddie could laugh about it. "It's funny now," he said, "but man, I was hot. I was a kid, and I'd worked so hard for that sound. And then you hear someone just rip it off on stage? You go, no way." Rick Derringer never denied the story, never admitted it either. When asked about Eddie later, he simply said, "He's a monster player. Nobody can touch him." Maybe that was his way of making peace. By the early 80s, Eddie had moved on, building new guitars, inventing new tones, chasing fresh ideas. The Derringer story became just one more moment in a career defined by invention. But it left him with one lasting truth: being great means being copied. And protecting originality isn't arrogance, it's survival. Years later, when asked about imitators, Eddie smiled and said, "You can copy the licks, but not the spirit." And that's what music is, spirit. He'd faced imitators, rivals, and even heroes who borrowed his fire. But the next one wasn't about imitation. It was about intimidation. What happened when Eddie Van Halen crossed paths with the man who once ruled the guitar world? In the early 1980s, two guitar prodigies stood at the center of rock's storm: Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Both were young, both were revolutionizing guitar playing, and both were being compared endlessly. For Eddie, those comparisons cut deep. What began as admiration soon turned into rivalry, and perhaps Quiet resentment. Eddie's feelings toward Rhodes weren't built on hatred alone. They were rooted in pride, competition, and the fear of being eclipsed. In a book called Randy Rhodes, Reflections of a Guitar Icon, archive audio captures Eddie reflecting on the young guitarist's rise. His words were sharp, layered with honesty and defensiveness. He was one guitarist who was honest anyway. Because he said everything he did, he learned from me. He was good. But I don't really think he did anything that I haven't done. And there ain't nothing wrong with it. I've copied other people, you know. That's classic Eddie. Part compliment, part challenge. He acknowledged Rhodes' talent but immediately drew a line in the sand. You learned from me. It wasn't arrogance as much as it was Eddie reclaiming ownership of the guitar revolution he started. Tapping, dive bombs, harmonic squeals, all the techniques that defined 80s guitar were suddenly everywhere. And some of those echoes were coming from Randy's fingertips. Rhodes, meanwhile, had come from a very different world. He was classically trained, disciplined, and almost studious in his approach to music. Where Eddie was instinct and fire, Randy was precision and form. Together, they represented the two poles of modern guitar playing, chaos and control. Fans couldn't resist comparing them, and that constant tug-of-war made its way into every magazine headline and backstage conversation. Ozzy Osbourne, who worked with Randy, later responded to Eddie's comments with disbelief. Speaking to Rolling Stone magazine, Ozzy said, "I heard recently that Eddie Van Halen said he taught Randy all his licks. He never. To be honest, Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. Maybe they had a falling out or whatever, but they were rivals." That word, rivals, perfectly captures it. This wasn't open war. It was cold competition. Both knew the other was brilliant. Both knew comparisons were inevitable. And in a scene fueled by ego, identity, and innovation, neither wanted to be seen as second best. There's even a story that Rhodes' guitar tech once taped a photo of Eddie Van Halen to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal. Every time Rhodes stepped on it, he was, quite literally, stomping on Eddie. It was half joke, half symbol. It was playful, yes, but also revealing. Rhodes wanted to carve his own legacy, free from comparisons, but Eddie's name followed him everywhere. Beneath Eddie's frustration lay something human. Vulnerability. He wasn't just a guitar god, he was a man who'd changed the language of rock guitar, and was suddenly hearing that language spoken back at him by someone else. When he said, he was honest anyway, it almost sounded like a sigh. A small recognition that imitation, at least when acknowledged, was a form of respect. And yet, there was more than ego in Eddie's words. There was a kind of wounded pride. The guitar scene in the late 70s and early 80s was fiercely competitive. Every player was trying to push boundaries, to be faster, louder, and more innovative. Eddie had built his reputation from scratch, inventing tones, creating the brown sound, and pioneering techniques that made jaws drop. To see those ideas mirrored by another player, no matter how talented, stirred complicated emotions. Tragically, Randy Rhodes' story ended far too soon. His death in a 1982 plane crash froze that rivalry in time. He never got the chance to evolve beyond the comparisons, or to see how his legacy might have intersected or reconciled with Eddie's in later years. For Eddie, that loss probably added another layer of complexity. How do you resolve feelings toward someone who's gone? You can't. The competition remains suspended in memory, unresolved, eternal. In later interviews, Eddie rarely revisited Rhodes directly, but when he did, his tone had softened. The bite was gone, replaced by quiet reflection. Maybe he understood that rivalry and respect were two sides of the same coin, that the reason it mattered so much was because Rhodes was that good. When you think about it, maybe Eddie didn't hate Randy Rhodes at all. Maybe he saw too much of himself in him, and that reflection was both admiration and discomfort in equal measure. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out another interesting video by clicking on the link shown on your screen. See you on the other side.